Bill Holter writes at billholter.com. He worked as a retail stockbroker for 23 years, including 12 years as a branch manager at AG Edwards. He's an expert in international finance, and he is a joy to listen to. He's your friend and mine. Bill Holter, thank you for stopping by.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
I wanted to ask you, I've been following your work for years, great fan, wonderful analysis. And I heard somebody, it was Edward Dowd, and he was the kind of he was like a manager at BlackRock, I think, for a while. And he was talking about how the previous, let's call it health crisis that we all went through a couple years ago was a pretext to inject liquidity into the international markets, and because the system was kind of failing. And I wanted to start
Right.
there with the concept of, and just for my audience, just so that they know, there's something called the Eurodollar markets. And the Eurodollar markets are out of London, and they started with the Marshall Plan. And so when the United States becomes the world reserve currency, and we're ending World War II, we have to get dollars around the world. And we did it through pretending to help countries rebuild. We get dollars out there. And now, like, people think the Federal Reserve is really, really powerful, but they basically print up kind of like the physical money that's domestically used in the United States. But the 98% of money outside of the United States is the Treasury basically is in control of that in terms of bonds, but also these Eurodollar markets that are out of London. Incredibly powerful. And so my question to you, my opening question to you is, do you see kind of instability that's happening right now, say in Israel or in Ukraine, as a new Marshall Plan, an excuse, a pretext to inject liquidity into these global financial markets?
Well, there's no question war is quote profitable. So yeah, there will be that does it does take money. It takes capital to fight a war, and obviously we've sent what 100, 200 billion to Ukraine. We're obviously going to send billions to Israel. Going back to you mentioning Edward Dowd, and was it was convenient. Um, was it a coincidence? I don't think it was a coincidence. I mean, there were patents on COVID going back to 2015, 2016. There were patents uh, for vaccines going back that far, and I think personally that they waited until they needed to flood the system with capital, and that's what they did. I mean, the
Mhm.
system was breaking down in Q4 uh, 2019, and you could see that in the repo markets. The
Mhm.
repo markets were exploding. The Fed was having to put $100 billion a night into the system just to keep it under control.
Mhm.
So, you could say it was fortuitous. I think, in my opinion, it was released or done so that they could flood the system with cash. Um, we're back again to a situation where liquidity had tightened up. You did see, or you have seen, M2 money supply drop by 5% over the last 18 months. That's the first time that's happened since the Great Depression. So, uh, asking me about Ukraine and Israel, yeah, obviously that's going to pump money into the system, but it's not necessarily going to go into the system where it's needed. Let me go back when we were talking about money supply shrinking. That's at the same time interest rates have exploded on a percentage basis, unlike ever before in history, and that's on top of the largest debt pile under any metric in all of history. So uh, it looks to me like it's a planned demolition.
Well, there was Jim Rickards is a guy who kind of goes around the circles as well, and he talks about kind of currency wars between countries. And one of the things that I've noticed is that China has been calling in loans, right? And kind of like these kind of, the United States will jockey for position, then China will jockey for position. And so what this does when they call in for loans is they're causing a global deflationary crisis, because those loans have to be paid in dollars, right? And then China basically takes loans from, like Nigeria, Kenya, Pakistan, whatever, and then they kind of take that money in and then sit on it. And then they're pulling it out of circulation. And then this is causing this, this is adding to, I mean, it's not causing the crisis, but it's another thing that's causing tensions and stress, like
Right.
internationally.
Yeah, that's correct. Understand that China did not invent, and actually the United States probably didn't, but if you go back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, read a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Mm.
I forget the author's first
John
name, but his
Perkins.
last name is Perkins. John Perkins. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, read that. And that's pretty much the model of what China is doing. They call the loans in. If they don't get paid back, then they end up with the asset. And, they've lent money all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, either way, whether the loans get paid or they don't get paid, money supply or liquidity does not expand. It actually contracts.
Yeah, I did a presentation once on Triffin's dilemma, right? And just for the audience, Triffin's dilemma, some Belgian American economist named Triffin, I think Robert Triffin, came up with talking about when an empire has the world's reserve currency, it suddenly comes into crisis because the rest of the world wants, say in this case, dollars. It used to be Dutch guilders, and it was English pounds, pound sterling, and then now that it's dollars, all these countries are like, hey, we need more dollars to do transactions, print up more bonds. We need more money for our central banks, et cetera, to buy petroleum products and everything. And so what they do is that causes them to hyperinflate the money supply to deal with the global grid,
Right.
but this hurts them domestically. So they're sacrificing their domestic. So all of a sudden you see all this inflation happening domestically to help the global. So it's Catherine Austin Fitts said that. She said that Trump represented like that time period of, there were people who wanted to sacrifice America for the global empire and other people who wanted to save America at the expense of the global empire. And that's what that fight was about. And you kind of see that in terms of monetary policy.
Right. But understand it's a different world today, because when the cases that Triffin was studying, those currencies were gold backed. Our currency is not gold backed. So with previous reserve currencies, they would have a run on their gold. There's no such thing as a run on American gold because we've been off that gold standard since August of 1971. But to answer your question, yeah, absolutely. It is inflationary because the U.S. has got to print more and more capital to keep up with trade, to be able to clear and settle trade.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things too is there was a guy named Marco Giulio, I think was his name, and he was talking about. Okay, here, let me play it. It's in Spanish though.
Pero a partir de la caída del muro de Berlín, a partir de la revolución tecnológica, se va produciendo un proceso por el cual la oligarquía financiera mundial, que no tiene nada que ver con el capitalismo industrial, es decir, no tiene que ver con el capitalismo, ¿no es cierto?, de Henry Ford, que hace autos. ¿Está? Eso es un capitalista industrial, produce cosas. Su economía no es la economía del casino, no es la economía de la producción, no la economía del casino. Esta oligarquía financiera mundial, ¿no es cierto?, va tomando mayor autonomía. Primero la caída del muro de Berlín, la revolución tecnológica. ¿Por qué la revolución tecnológica? La revolución tecnológica porque ahora esa oligarquía financiera mundial puede dar golpes de estados, eufemísticamente llamados golpes de mercado, que suelen ser mucho más duros y mortíferos que un golpe normal o que un bombardeo, más eficiente que un bombardeo. Entonces se empieza a independizar de la necesidad de estar aliado a la potencia principal, que es la que antes le servía dando un garrote a aquellos que no respetaban el orden establecido por esta oligarquía y la potencia mundial.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that author, but I would say, yeah, there's two markets. I mean, you've got the real economy and you've got the financial economy. The financial economy, and obviously they affect each other. I mean, the amount of leverage put into the system, you couldn't have had the actual real growth in the real system without the increases in credit. And of course, the increases in credit, I mean, all you have to do is look at global debt, 350, 400 trillion. And how could there be over $2 quadrillion worth of derivatives created if the credit was not available? So I think it all boils down to credit. And when credit fails, both the financial economy and the real economy fail. The financial economy fails because it's basically a global margin call, and the real economy fails because, and I've used this as an example probably 100 times, a loaf of bread has at least a dozen uses of credit to get that wheat from the field into the form of a loaf of bread that you can buy at your grocer. So um, a lowering of credit, or if you want to call it a margin call, whatever you want to call it, is going to destroy both the financial economy and the real economy.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine. He's an economist. He's like 90 now, and his name's Bruce Yandel, and he's an economist at Clemson University. And he was talking about that after 2008, how they were basically the commercial banks weren't lending anymore. They could get bonds and get a
Right.
guaranteed 3% return, and so they just bought bonds and stopped helping local businesses. So now you don't have a guy who can start a pizza shop or a guy who can start a bowling alley because there's no credit. All of a sudden, there's this credit
Right.
just freeze. The system goes into vapor lock, like you said. So how can you make a loaf of bread if without that supply chain, without credit, dozen points along the supply chain, whether it's the guy who does the trucking or the fuel or the warehouse, like all those people rely on credit. And if the banks are shutting that off, and now you're seeing something really weird happening where you're seeing like Apple has like $1 trillion in liquid assets, and they're becoming like a shadow banking bank where they're loaning, they're becoming a de facto bank. They're stepping into that void that the commercial banks are
Exactly.
creating. And so I was reading this book called The Divine Right of Capital by Marjorie Kelly. And she talked about at the time that of the 100 largest GDPs on planet Earth, 69 of them were corporations. Where now, like Apple has more
Right.
money than England. Where Nike has more money than Brazil. And all of a sudden you see the
Right.
power shifting from nation states to these corporations that are, to jump it,
Yeah.
jump
There's
it.
Well, it's happening again. I mean, what happened in 2007, 2008? Just look at commercial real estate. I just posted an article uh, last night. There's over $3 billion of, uh, if you want to call it upside down loans in Dallas alone. So, I mean, this is not just New York. It's not just San Francisco. I mean, the examples, uh, San Francisco, they just had a hotel foreclosed on where there was roughly a 70% drop in equity below the loan itself. So, I mean, these things are they're defaulting, they're deflating, and that is absolutely deflationary on a system wide basis. Um, and I've talked for years and years that we would have inflation and deflation at the same time, and that's happening. I mean, your
Stagflation.
cost to live, yeah. Well, uh, but it's not just your normal stagflation. This is systemic, and I mean your cost to live is obviously going up, but you're looking at a huge deflation because we hit that debt saturation. Once you hit debt saturation, a couple things happen. Uh, Either lenders aren't lending, or borrowers don't or can't borrow. And once that happens, it's you just ask yourself what happens in a Ponzi scheme when there's no more new investors. And that's exactly where we are now. And that's where we were back in 2007, 2008. And I mean, I'll confess the one thing I missed in 2007, 2008, and then into 2009, I never dreamed that sovereign treasuries and central banks would destroy their own balance sheets to try to keep the game going.
Yeah. I mean, what's going on now is crazy. I wanted to circle back just really quickly. I'm reading a book right now called A Hacker's
Let me
Mind.
just mention this
Okay.
time around. Let me just mention
No,
that
finish.
this time around, there's no one to save. There's no white knight to come in. Who's going to come in and save the U.S. Treasury? Who's going to come in and save the Fed or the ECB or the Bank of Japan, whatever?
Mhm.
There is no savior this time around. They've already blown their balance sheets up, and there's no ability for a savior to come in and save the saviors, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. I mean, the Fed, that was 2007, 2008 was the last time that the Fed had enough money to be able to buy up like toxic
Right.
assets and stanch the system. And now they didn't do any reform and things went on steroids. And now, kind of, and whether it's by chance or design, Like if you go back to John Maynard Keynes, he it said it back in the 30s and 40s, when people said, hey, the system's eventually going to melt down. And he famously said, yeah, but we'll be dead by then. So,
Right.
so whether it's just an evil cabal of people or whether just systemically, just the way that the system that we were running, like Keynesian economics, was going to implode anyway. It doesn't matter, but we're there right now. And I know you're a huge gold
That
guy.
was the plan.
Yeah. So what
That was
do
the
you
plan.
see going
It
forward? I
was the
mean,
plan
like,
from 1913.
mhm,
That was the plan from 1913 when they started the Fed. I mean,
mhm.
they knew mathematically this thing there was there there was only a brick wall at the end, and we're at the brick wall.
So what's on the other side of that wall? I know they have CBDCs, they want digital currencies, but is that just a transitional stage? And then they're talking about BRICS, and there's rumors. There's a guy named Sergey. What's his name? Is it Lavrov? Can't remember, but his name is no Glossiev. Sergey Glossiev is the guy from BRICS who's trying to come up with like a basket of currencies, and it'll have like precious metals and all this kind of stuff. I mean, what do you think is going to be on the other side of that brick wall?
Well, the brick wall is a or several resets. Obviously, there's a financial reset coming because the math doesn't work. Um, and whatever they come up with initially is not going to work. The first reset is going to fail. There's got to be a Mother Nature reset. And it does look like the BRICS, China, Russia, they're going to do some type of real backing to currencies,
Mhm.
whether it be gold will be part of it. And you know that because they've been accumulating it. There may be oil, there may be other commodities, who knows? Um, but what they want is real and fair settlement. And what the U.S. has done for 100 years, basically, is the never pay model. They just keep rolling the debt forward, expanding the debt, and no one ever really gets settled or paid. They just get paid in dollars, which is a promise to pay more dollars.
Yeah.
So the big reset, in my opinion, is going to be from west to east, the power, and that's going to follow what's already happened. The gold has already moved from west to east.
Mhm.
And he who has the gold makes the rules, and he who has the gold has the power. So to me, it looks like uh, the West has borrowed all this capital, and we lived on it. We ate off of it. We ate our seed corn. And just look at, I mean, China has a huge debt problem, but when debt blows up, what are they left with? They're left with new airports. They're left with rail systems. They're left with cities. They built stuff. They didn't eat. They didn't eat their seed corn. We did.
Yeah, I mentioned Carlotta Perez before. That was the name I was struggling for, and it was "Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital" was her book, and that was a big kind of all the Silicon Valley people were reading it, and her premise about financial capital versus productive capital. And so it is interesting geopolitically. You see the West, which is financial capital, versus the global South, which is kind of productive capital, where they want to build things. They want it like Richard Florida, the futurist Richard Florida said, what pulled us out of the Great Depression was not World War II. He said it was the building of the interstate highway system in the suburbs, that all that construction kind of lifted us out of the economic doldrums. And so these other countries in Eurasia are looking to build. They're looking to build the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. They're looking to actually create real things, real wealth, as opposed to fake paper wealth. And you mentioned before, I wanted to hit this. There was a book called A Hacker's Mind. And in there, the gentleman talks about, I think his name's Bruce Schneier, and he talks about all these empty buildings in New York, these luxury buildings where you can get like an apartment for $10 million or $50 million or $100 million, and they're sitting empty. 80% of the building is empty. And he said, like, what's basically happening is that you'll get like a narco kingpin, and he buys that, that unit, and he doesn't put any people in it because then he can't list it as an asset. And then he borrows money against that asset, puts it in the stock market, and voila, the money is washed, right? And it's like a money laundering thing. And this is good for that criminal class, that international criminal class, the hot money people going around the world, but it's bad for real estate prices. They're driving up the market for everybody else by doing these kind of scammy
Right.
things. And I remember, just to mention her again, Catherine Austin Fitts said that she described She ran HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and so she described
Right.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as the CIA's candy store because they would launder money through real estate. You know,
Sure.
so I mean that might
Yeah.
answer what you mentioned. The real estate market is just a shell game.
Well, I mean, if you get hot money or illicit money coming in, it's only going to last for so long. And the real estate market has already turned. And I mean, you can look at what you need to do is look at volume, the amount of
Mhm.
closings, the amount of things that are contracted, and those have collapsed. I mean, in some cases, 50% or more. And price always, in every market, always follows volume. Price
Mhm.
follows volume. Don't ever forget that. Um, One other thing I want to mention as far as the reset is concerned, I think in the West, uh, the thought process in order to retain power, if you have not read The Great Taking, you should read it because basically what they're talking about is bailing in the entire system. And this is not a hypothetical, it's not a theory. These laws have already been put in place. So if you've got stocks with a broker and your broker goes down, those aren't your stocks. Those are on the broker's balance sheet. If you have money in the bank, FDIC, in 2014 or 2013, uh, put in their charter that there wouldn't be any more bailouts. There'd be bail-ins. When you put money into the bank, you are not depositing the money. You are not a depositor. You are a lender. You're a creditor. Uh, so the I shouldn't say you're a creditor. You're a lender, and basically the bank can take your money for their survival. And I've not actually read the legalese on it, but within the book, The Great Taking, it talks about not only is it brokers, banks, insurance companies, it's also the clearinghouses themselves.
Mhm.
For instance, the transfer agents. If you have stock with a transfer agent and they get into some kind of trouble, your stock is not yours. It's on their balance sheet. It's theirs. And this is not just a U.S. thing. This is all throughout the West. It's the way the laws are written.
Mhm.
So my past partner Jim Sinclair's terminology, GOTS, get out of the system and have as few counterparties as possible. That looks more prescient than it ever did.
Yeah, I mean, like, I wanted to ask you as well something else. That was I had a previous conversation with somebody, and I mentioned the disconnect in the system. Like, there's a book called Unbalanced by Stephen Roach, and he talks about China and how the United States was basically our corporations were reliant on the savings of the Chinese. They were one of the highest saving populations, as opposed to us,
Right.
where we spend 100% of what we make and then we go like 13% into debt. So we're like at negative 113% for savings. And that's the way the system here was designed. It punishes savings ever since the Fed. You mentioned the Fed before. It punishes savings because, hey, if I don't spend it now, I'll lose money because the money is depreciating so fast. So I better spend. And they did that on purpose to
Right.
basically get liquidity, get everybody in there. And I find it ironic that when they created the Social Security system, it was under the premise of, hey, we're going to, people aren't saving enough. So the government is going to help you save. But now the government is telling you saving is bad. It's hoarding. Don't save. Get your money out of there. They hate savers because those are people taking money out of the system, and it creates a deflationary crisis. And so yeah, there's this schizophrenia, this disconnect where on the one hand, the Stephen Roach is saying, hey, our system is falling apart because we don't have enough savers, and now China is drying up, so they're not buying our stocks for our corporations, their pension plans and all that kind of stuff because they're one child policy, they're aging out, so that liquid pool of capital that was holding up our corporations is going away. So we need more savers, but then the system is saying don't save. It's such a weird,
Right. It's
you
a
know,
dichotomy. Yeah, it's
yeah.
absolutely a dichotomy. And understand that whatever Social Security started out as, it ended up as a source of funds for the U.S. Treasury because everything within Social Security are U.S. Treasuries or agency-backed securities. So it was a source of funding. It was a way to uh, fund deficits.
Yeah, I remember Bill Clinton famously, everybody, like the talking points of, oh, Bill Clinton presided over the tech boom and, balanced budgets and all this stuff. But really, he raided Social Security
Yeah,
to
right.
paper over kind of the dot-com, like downturn,
Correct.
and it created that precedent. And so, yeah, everything is a house of cards, like a shell game. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of leave it here, but I wanted to ask you one final question. Like, what do you see, in your very prescient Bill Holter mind, going forward? Like, if the system goes through this transitional period, this, as the old system starts to show stress and fall apart, what do you see for America? I mean, going forward.
I long term, I don't know, but I can tell you during the transition, which obviously is going to include a financial collapse, there will also be a societal collapse. I talked about probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago that at some point in time, we would end up in a Mad Max scenario, whether it be for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, God forbid, 6 months or a year. But at some point in time, we are going to go through a Mad Max scenario where there are no services. You have what you have, you're on your own, and that's it. Well, either you survive or you don't.
Wow, that's pretty dark. Okay, so I will leave it there, and I want to thank you for coming on, Bill Holter. Bill Holter can be found at billholter.com. But Bill, tell the viewers like where else they can find your work.
Yeah, well, obviously, I do interviews like this. If you go to billholter.com, there is an icon up top. You can see all of my interviews. We post other interviews also. There's an icon there if you want to touch base with me if you're looking to purchase gold or silver. I am a precious metals broker. That's what I do. You can click on contact us, or you can use my business email. It's bholter@hotmail.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Bill. You're the best, and I hope to have you on soon if you'll have me. But you're awesome, man.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'd like to take a moment to thank you for watching. If you'd like to stay updated, hit the like and subscribe buttons. But more importantly, if you don't want to see me reduced to shelling my old merch, such as the Daniel Natal in action figure, where you can see Daniel engaging in an action as he watches TV, or engaging in an action as he surfs the internet, or failed products like the Daniel Natal Pez dispenser, or the even more ill-considered Daniel Natal urinal cake, think about supporting the show by buying one of my books. For instance, you can buy my book, Actionable Ethics. The link is in the description below.